Howard G. Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called Dialectical Ethics. And the paper's first going to start by talking about something called absolute moral conditionality. And what that means, it's trying to find a middle ground between moral relativism and moral absolutism. And what it's going to say is that the category of murder is absolutely morally evil. Like whenever murder occurs, it is evil. But here's the thing. Is it the case that every time a person has their life taken from them, or every time an animal has their life taken from them, is that an example of murder or is it an example of killing? It's possible for killing not to be immoral, say if the animal is suffering, say if it was an accident that got the person killed. Those would be examples of killing, of taking a life, but they wouldn't be murder. So this is a problem because although we can establish an absolute category, an absolute moral category of saying murder is evil, in order to figure out if a given example of a life being lost is murder instead of killing, we'd have to be on the ground. We'd have to be there, we'd have to be present to determine all the variables. And although it's tempting to say because we have to do that, that therefore there is no ethical living, it's all just relative, it's all just opinion. I think that'd be taking it a little far because murder is always wrong. It's just not always clear what falls under the category of murder, so you have to be on the ground. Why this is important is because if it is the case that to really identify murder from killing, you have to be present, it's not going to make a lot of sense to think that we can tell what's a moral evil, because this logic will apply to theft and arson and all these other different crimes. You have to be present. Then you really need to be embedded in the situation, part of participating in the situation in order to determine what's good and what's wrong. And this is really important because then people who are standing on the outside of situations, who have ideas of what happened or what ought to be done, are automatically, they should be viewed with skepticism. They're automatically disqualified. And so you can see in this idea of absolute moral conditionality a defense between outside forces or outside views of what's going on in a given situation. The people who are given power to make the decision are the people involved in the situation. It should also be noted, it's elaborated on in the paper, that if you don't have any possibility of an ethical life, of a good life, of some things being better than others, of there being good choices, if it's all just relative, then it's going to be very difficult to give people a sense of a reason or a reason to live. You actually need ethical life to have reason life. There was an idea classically that the whole reason we reason was to determine the good, and motivation is always directed toward what we think is good. And so if we don't believe that there's an ability to determine the good, we're also going to have a trouble giving ourselves motivation. So reason and reason are connected together. That's elaborated on in the paper, but I wanted to bring it up here. And evidence that you have a society that's lost reason, which could be tied to moral reasoning, could be the prevalence of boredom, because boredom isn't so much about having nothing to do, but having lost the capacity to see significance in what could be done. Anyway, if we take the idea seriously that we need to be embedded in a situation to determine what ought to be done, then what we can talk about is a difference between isness and suchness. And this gets us into David Hume. David Hume very famously divided isness and oughtness, where he said, you can never, from determining what something is, say what it ought to do. So there's this big divide, and moral philosophers have been debating it forever. But what's really important is that David Hume is kind of making a distinction between isness and suchness. And what I mean by that is what David Hume wants to stop is people standing on the outside and saying, that thing in there is murder, therefore we ought to step in and stop that person. Or from an outside totalitarian dictator saying that town is contributing to injustice, therefore we ought to step in and stop that town. David Hume sees the ability to identify isness, which is inherently philosophical, as a way that power can control, a way that people can control other people's lives. David Hume wants to defend a common life. He wants to defend common people. Whereas suchness, what David Hume wants to say is that we can determine oughtness only in the realm of suchness, which basically is experience, which is lived experience. When David Hume says you can't go from is to ought, he means the idea of is to the idea of ought. But we can certainly, from the use of an object, let's say the use of a refrigerator, determine that it ought to be used to store food, to keep it cold. We can determine from our relationship with Jane, who we see every morning, that we ought to treat Jane with respect, that we ought not to call Jane Susan or something because he doesn't like that name. So from lived experience, you can most certainly make determinations of what ought to be done. But what David Hume wants to do is make a very careful split between is and ought, to say that if you want to, between is and suchness, in order to claim that oughtness only belongs in the realm of suchness, of experience, and that when you place oughtness in the realm of isness, you're inviting power, you're inviting manipulation, you're inviting common people to have their lives upended. David Hume's also very concerned, as a historian, he studied all these churches and governments and states and rulers who were compelled by a moral vision to be tyrannical, to control, to step in and stop the evil people, if you will. So David Hume has seen how ethics is used in the name of rationalizing violence. It's used in the name of rationalizing evil. And he strongly believes that that can be contained if ethics must be contained to suchness, because suchness is the realm where sentiment develops. And sentiment is basically empathy. It is moral feeling. David Hume believes that we are moral not because we read ethical philosophy, but because we encounter our neighbor. It's from the raw encounter of our neighbor and people that we are ethical. And so if ethics must be contained to sentiment, sentiment is inherently contained by suchness. It is inherently contained. And if you are automatically disqualified to create moral premises outside of suchness, then expansive, general, universal moral premises that can be applied to people's lives who we have nothing to do with, who we know nothing about, is automatically deconstructed, is automatically disqualified. And so an ethic of suchness is contained. It is bound. It cannot be used in mass nationalistic campaigns of religion, to launch invasions, to control foreign countries, or things like that. So the ethics of suchness is contained. And for David Hume, ethics are so incredibly powerful that if they're not contained, then they're probably going to be used as a force of destruction. They're going to be used in service of destruction. Generally, David Hume considers philosophy's main problem, that philosophy is the main problem that philosophy has to address, because philosophy can be about anything. The conversation of philosophy never stops, and it can always expand into different subjects. Since philosophy can be about any subject, it can go on forever, and therefore ethical thought can go on forever and expand. Well, then ethics can consume everything, and it can be all-consuming, and it must be bound. If it is not bound, it inevitably will become a force of destruction. And David Hume basically predicts the French Revolution, the violence of the 20th century, the world wars, all of which are postured as philosophical conflicts. What is meant by that is expanded in the paper. So anyway, far from an amoralist who destroys ethics, David Hume is in the business of making sure that ethics stay good, that they aren't used in service of power to control, and he does that by binding ethics to suchness and separating it from isness. And once ethics is found in the realm of suchness, then we have to pay attention to our lives in order to determine ethics. We can't just think about it. We have to exist in a dialectical relationship between what we experience and what we think. We can't just do one or the other. So David Hume's ethics is inherently dialectical ethics that are bound by the realm of suchness and only found in the realm of suchness. And as the paper will go into, ultimately we should use philosophy and ethics in service of defending and helping Aunt Martha. But anyway, for more, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that. And thank you for your time.